So I'd like to welcome everybody to this lecture here at Basel University. It is today September 1, 2011, so we're almost exactly 10 years after the terrorist attacks. And this is the occasion why I have decided to do this lecture with the title, The Terrorist Attacks of September 2001, What Do We Know 10 Years Later? A Historical Investigation. It is obviously a very large topic, a vast field of research, and I've therefore decided to look at 10 different issues. Because we have 60 minutes, so I'm not going to talk endlessly. We're just going to go through 10 points, and I'm fully aware of the fact that further research is needed on most of these points, and I'm fully aware of the fact that there are other points which would be interesting, but which we can't discuss today. What are the issues? The first chapter is really that I look at the different stories that are available today on the attacks of 9/11. I call them surprise, LEHOP and MEHOP. I will detail what they actually mean later. Then I look in the second chapter on the 9/11 debate in the United States. In a third chapter, I will address the term conspiracies, because that term has surfaced a lot during the last 10 years. Then I will look at WT7, which is one of the buildings which was involved. Then I look at the Pentagon, which is another rather big discussion. I will look at financial transactions that took place on September 11 in the segment of put options. I will look at able danger, which is another research topic where quite a few people are working on. I will look at Osama bin Laden, of course. I will look at Northwoods and then reach the conclusion. It is very often the case that in Switzerland lectures are in German. Okay, most of the time lectures are in German. We have some lectures here at Basel University which are in English. This lecture here is in English because it is a lecture that we do together with Indiana University in Bloomington in the United States. They have a topic which is called Making War, Making Peace. And it's a research group which is now currently discussing these issues, war and peace. And they said, why don't you come over to the United States and give a lecture on 9/11? And I said, I'd much rather do this in Switzerland, make a videotape and send you the link. So that's what we decided upon. That's what I'm actually doing. The people in the United States who organized the lecture are Heather Reynolds, professor for biology, then Kurt Lively and Baron Bangert. And from this moment, I'd like to say, Heather and everybody else, hello in the United States. Good that we can do this international research project, as I'd like to call it, together. This is really a change that you need to be aware of. International research has been very strongly influenced by the development of modern technology, the internet, streaming videos, live conference, and all these things. I mean, 20 years ago, this would not have been possible, but today it is, so we take advantage of it. My lecture will have the exactly same topic. It will be shown in the US, I think, in October. So we're a little bit earlier here in Switzerland, and so to give you the overview again of the international framework, we're here in Switzerland. For everybody else in the United States, that's where we are. We're in Basel. Basel is in the corner where Switzerland and Germany and France meet. It's a German-speaking part of Switzerland. Switzerland is a small country with 7 million inhabitants. And the United States, obviously, over here, and Indiana University is here in the state of Indiana. Okay, let's go into the debate of 9/11. On that day, most people watch television. And they made up their mind what happened on that day, and they had, a gut feeling what was happening, and they got information from the American government, from the Bush administration. Then later they read in the newspaper information on 9/11. Some then watched videos, and others started to look at the issue at the internet and further bought maybe DVDs and whatever. So we have a lot of different stories circulating on the topic of 9/11. And I'm a historian, and you must know that in the end, history is written by historians. So it's really our task at the end of the day to say what happened. And that is really difficult, that's what I have to say. And therefore I try to, first of all, look what different stories we have on the internet, in the books, also in the public debate. And I think basically you can say we have three stories. The first story is called surprise story. It really says that bin Laden was responsible for the attack. 19 Muslims carried it out, and the administration of George Bush and Dick Cheney was surprised by the attacks. So that's the official version of the events. The second story says, no, that's not the correct narrative, and it's called LIHOP, let it happen on purpose. So LIHOP really stands for let it happen on purpose. People who think that is the correct story emphasize that yes, it was bin Laden who carried out the attacks. 19 Muslims attacked the United States, but the Bush government and Cheney are corrupt. And they knew that the attacks were coming and let them happen on purpose and sacrificed the life of 3,000 people in order then to start international wars, resource wars, grab oil and gas, reduce civil liberties, etc. And the third theory is called MIHOP, make it happen on purpose. This story says bin Laden had nothing to do with the attacks. It says all these videos we've seen from bin Laden are fake, and that criminal elements within the US Defense Department and in the Secret Services were responsible for the attack. An attack which then is called inside job on the own population. And these three theories compete. Okay? They cannot be true at the same time. That's the most important thing to realize. From a logical point of view, you completely and easily recognize that not all three theories can be right at the same time. It's either the one or the other or the third. And I personally don't know which of the three is correct. Okay? So what I will say at the end of the lecture is really that we need more research. But I can show you in this lecture where the debate really is. Okay? Why they debate and how they debate. First question is, why is it so important to know which of the three is correct? 10 years after, you could say, who cares? Maybe it was the one or the other. It is very important, I'm very strongly convinced, because peace research must tackle the issue of 9/11. What is peace research? Peace research is not an established doctrine at Basel University or many other universities. You can't go there and say, I'd like to have a master or a bachelor or a doctorate degree in peace research. You can't do that. So you can have a doctorate in history like I have. But historians are very interested in questions of war and peace. And generally, if we look at 9/11, we obviously see it has to do a lot with international peace and war events. So those people who are interested in the promotion of peace, and there's a lot of people on the globe, believe me, they are interested to know what happened on 9/11. Furthermore, 9/11 is important because right after 9/11, that's only 3 weeks after 9/11, we had the start of the war in Afghanistan. The war in Afghanistan started on October 7, 2001. Most people have forgotten that it was just a few weeks after 9/11 that this war started. And if we debate the war in Afghanistan, we can only debate it in the context of 9/11. We must try to understand what happened in 9/11. The official narrative, the surprise narrative, obviously said bin Laden carried out the attacks. He is in Afghanistan, protected by the Taliban. Therefore, it is necessary to wage war against Afghanistan. That is the official narrative. What happened in Afghanistan in the meantime is that you have a new Afghan president. It is Hamid Karzai. And that is well known, and people obviously, argue whether, that was a good thing for Afghanistan to happen. Because if you look at the person of Hamid Karzai, some people say, that's much better than the Taliban, and others say, no, that's not much better. Because allegations are, and I'm not going to go into the details of the Afghan war. Allegations are that Hamid Karzai and other parts of the Afghan government are involved in the drug trade. And people sometimes ask me, why are they involved in the drug trade? And I say, well, Afghanistan is a huge producer of drugs. And the warlords that control large parts of Afghanistan, they support the government only if the government protects them. Okay? So if the Afghan government tries to pick a fight with the warlords who run the drug trade, they're out of business. So Afghanistan is very complicated, and I'm not going to talk about it at length. I'm going to talk about another event that is linked to 9/11. It is the US war against Iraq. It started on March 20, 2003. Some of you might remember that right after 9/11, there were people who tried to link 9/11 to Iraq. That was wrong from the beginning. But later, in 2003, you had this link, you know. There were quotes that, you know, Al-Qaeda is operative in Iraq, and therefore we have to go to Iraq. We means US government. So the Iraq war is another war linked to these terrorist attacks. And what happened in Iraq really is that you have a new prime minister. Now, you have Saddam Hussein, who was removed from power. That's the main, you know, event that happened there. You have the oil resources that were distributed in a new way. And you have Nouri al-Maliki, who is now the prime minister. Obviously, here again, there are huge debates whether that is a big progress or not. But then, you know, you need to go into the details of what Maliki is doing, whether he's one of those who opens Iraq for democracy, or whether he's in that old gang of political leaders who oppress their population. What we do know is that American soldiers who fought in the Iraq war, and you know the Iraq war is not over, there's still American troops there, it's just they're not called combat troops anymore. So the semantics has changed. But the American troops that fight there have always rationalized their presence in Iraq with reference to 9/11. There's evidence for that. We look at helmets, you know, in history with many different sources. And we look at the helmets of US soldiers fighting in Iraq, and they make designs on their helmets. And here you can see the Pentagon and the Twin Towers. And in 2006, there was a survey which was, made in Iraq among US troops. And 85% of American soldiers said that the main mission was to retaliate for Saddam's role in the September 11 attacks. And that is really surprising, because Saddam Hussein had no role in the 9/11 attacks. So that is war propaganda. That makes your mind twisted, and it can twist your mind to such an extent that you can end up in a war where you might get killed or lose a leg just because you're not well informed. And that is really tragic. That's not a detail. Now, how did this misinformation surface? It was, first of all, this claim of weapons of mass destruction. It was Secretary of State Colin Powell who said in the United Nations Security Council in February 2003, that's 1 month before the Iraq war started, he said there are weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. Now, that was a lie, okay? And that lie really started to increase the distrust globally towards the Bush administration. When people found out that the Bush administration had lied about Iraq, they went further and said, did they lie about 9/11 as well? You know, these things are very, very closely linked. It's all about trust. Do you trust the government? Do you trust the president? Do you trust the prime minister? Or do you categorically question what they say? Colin Powell, in 2005, offered an excuse for his, lies. He said he felt terrible and apologized for having falsely presented an Iraqi weapons program that turned out not to exist. I'm the one who presented it on behalf of the United States to the world. It will always be part of my record. That is painful. So Powell is one of the very few who offered his excuses. At the same time, before the Iraq war, you had President Bush insisting on the same story. He was saying there are weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. We must go into Iraq because otherwise Saddam Hussein will give the weapons of mass destruction to the terrorists, and you will have a new 9/11 with biological or chemical weapons. And that really scared people. So that most people then said, yes, okay, then we should do this war. Because if you ask people, do you want to go into war? Most people say no. Then you ask them again, but there's a bad man out there. Do you want to go to war? And they say no. You tell them, he has weapons of mass destruction. Then they say, no, I don't want to go there. I don't want to send my son. And then you ask them again, he has weapons of mass destruction, and he's going to give them to the terrorists. And somehow he was linked to 9/11, and everybody remembered that event. Then people have a strong feeling of fear. That's politics of fear. And it really works, because then people say, I'm actually against war, but this war, I'm for it, the last one. And that's how it works. It's always been like that. Now, the source, the direct statement that Bush made before the war is, intelligence gathered by this and other governments leaves no doubt that the Iraq regime continues to possess and conceal some of the most lethal weapons ever devised. That's just before the start of the war. The danger is clear. Using chemical, biological, or one-day nuclear weapons obtained with the help of Iraq, the terrorists could fulfill their stated ambitions and kill thousands or hundreds of thousands of innocent people in our country or any other. So if you do a historical interpretation of that quote, it very clearly is a quote that instills fear, and it works. When later people found out that it was not true, what Bush had said on that day, they started to have a very, very strong distrust. They started to have a very, very strong distrust towards the whole Bush administration. So on the left you have Colin Powell, who lied at the United Nations but later excused. There you have Dick Cheney, who wrote public articles that one should use torture, which created even more distrust. Then you have George Bush, the president himself, who lied about the weapons of mass destruction, but never offered an apology. Never. Then you have Condoleezza Rice. She said there are links between Al-Qaeda and Iraq. That's nonsense. There were no such links. And then on the very right, you have Rumsfeld, and seated you have the director of the CIA, George Tenet, and Andrew Card in the back. And you know, when I talk to people, it's really this picture that matters. It's the question, do you trust these people? And some people say, yes, I trust them. I think they told me the truth about 9/11. And other people say exactly the opposite and say, these people, that's the mafia. I don't trust them at all. They lied to me and they started wars. And as a historian, I'm in between, okay? I listen to people, what they say, and I try to find facts about all the events that have been happening during the last 10 years. Powell, who has been in the US military for a long time, was already active in the first Iraq war, which happened after Iraq had invaded Kuwait in August 1990. You know, remember that war? And then he knew the situation very well, and he said in 2005 that he had never seen evidence to suggest a connection between the attacks of September 11 and the regime of Saddam Hussein. So Powell is one of the few soldiers who stood up and said, I have a military honor, and this military honor tells me that I shouldn't lie. And he made it very clear. And he got a lot of problems. But he made it clear there's no link between 9/11 and Iraq. Now what you see is that more and more professors in the United States start to look at the last 10 years, Iraq, Afghanistan, 9/11, and ask, what is the cost? What have we done? What happened? For instance, Catherine Lutz, she's an anthropologist. Now you see this, people come from all different corners. Some are professors for biology, others are professors for anthropology, others are historians like me. So it's really, the scientists, it's not just one group, it's from different branches. And she says, after 10 years of war, it really is imperative to know how much we paid for these wars, and the cost is staggering. She's not questioning 9/11, she's more looking at Iraq and Afghanistan. Her colleague, Netta Crawford, she is doing political science. She tried to find out how many people were killed and how much money was spent during the last 10 years. Not only on September 11, but if you take together Iraq and Afghanistan and everything. And she comes to 225,000 killed, at least, probably more. And to more than $3 trillion spent. So that shows you it really is an important issue. We're not talking about details. If you compare this, we just now had in Europe this terrible attack in Norway, you know, where one person killed many, but he killed less than 100 people, okay? I'm not saying it's not important to research the Oslo terrorist incident. That's an important research field. But just if you look at the figures, you have to say that 100 dead on the one hand, and 225,000 dead, on the other hand, make it very imperative that we get some clarity on what happened during the last 10 years. And you have, suffering on all sides. First of all, you have American soldiers. This is a memorial ceremony in 2010 in Afghanistan. It's just the soldiers who are there and who are very sad because their brothers in arms get shot, they get maimed, they have their arms torn away, and they don't even know exactly why they are in Afghanistan. So that makes it very, very hard for their families to live in this complicated world that we all live in. And furthermore, you have the victims, the civilian victims in Iraq and in Afghanistan. I brought a picture from Samar Hassan. She's the most famous victim of the war in Iraq. That is a picture where Samar Hassan is 12 years old. And she's now in Mosul in Iraq. And she looks at a picture where she was 5 years old. Okay? She looks at the picture in this computer. It happens to be a similar computer that I have. But fact is that global communication, runs all across these computers. I'm now going to show you a picture, and if you don't want to see it, look away, because there's blood on it. Okay? There's blood on it because it's the picture taken when Samar Hassan was 5 years old, and her parents had just been killed by US soldiers in Iraq. And this is the first time she's seen the picture. That was published in the New York Times in May 2011, so it's rather new. And this is the original picture, which is coming now, which just shows you the pain of war. So if you think about all these 10 years, you realize it's quite important that we do some research on this. A further issue, which some people don't realize, is that NATO invocated Article 5 for the first time in history after 9/11. My students sometimes ask me, what is that Article 5? I don't know what it is. Now, NATO has been constructed during the Cold War as an alliance where if one member is attacked, everybody is attacked. Okay, that was the system. And we all thought, as historians, that it might be the Soviet Union who attacks Germany. And then everybody, also the US and Canada, would be involved in the war, and then you would have a war between Moscow and Washington. And then, as everybody said, Moscow's not going to do that. It never happened. It never happened. NATO never invoked Article 5 during the whole Cold War. And now, when September 11 happened, the US said, we've been attacked. And the attack came from Afghanistan. That's very important. The attack has to come from outside the NATO territory to invoke Article 5. And that meant that at the same day, all NATO countries were at war. Means Germany, France, Italy, Belgium, Norway, Canada, Spain, Portugal, Turkey, Greece. And most people have never understood that this was the case. At the time, NATO Secretary General George Robertson declared on October 2, 2001, so that was very quickly after the attack, that since it had been determined by NATO, that the 9/11 attacks had been directed by Osama bin Laden from abroad, from Afghanistan, Article 5 of the NATO Charter had to be invoked for the first time in NATO's history. The article says that an attack on any NATO member shall be considered to be an attack on all. Now, I've worked on NATO during much of my research time. That was before 9/11. And I published a book which has now been translated in 10 languages, and it's on NATO secret armies. It basically comes to the conclusion that NATO is not very transparent. It's the largest military organization of the world. And if you're interested in that topic, you can read it up in that book. But that's only about the Cold War, and that's not our subject today. But I want to make it very clear that most researchers never expected 9/11 to lead to an activation of NATO, and that was the case. So what we faced here today with is a debate on what really happened on 9/11. It's this surprise Lee-Hop-Me-Hop debate, and we are, as researchers, torn to this side, torn to that side, and it's really difficult. Who is the most prominent advocate of the surprise story? The surprise story is it was bin Laden who surprised the United States. The most prominent advocate is George Bush. And the problem is, when we look at sources, then we always check, is that source trustworthy? And the problem with George Bush is that he lied about the Iraq War. So his trustworthiness is reduced. He's still an important source because he's the president. Then you have other people, the 9/11 widows. These are the women who lost their children, their husband, who lost people in these attacks on the terrorists on 9/11. And they are very active. They pushed for a 9/11 investigation. It's only actually thanks to the 9/11 widows and that they stood up and said, we want to have more clarity on what happened, that we had a 9/11 commission who investigated the attacks. The 9/11 commission was presided by Thomas Keane and Lee Hamilton. That's Thomas Keane and that's Lee Hamilton. And they presented their 9/11 commission report in 2004 in the summer. So for historians, that was the most important book, because that was the official story. But the important thing to notice is that these two gentlemen were appointed by Bush, okay? So it was not an independent investigation. It was not Congress that investigated 9/11. It was selected people, former governors, former members of Congress, that investigated the attacks. And at the time when this investigation was carried out, one member of the 9/11 Commission said, this is not a good investigation. It has no solid access to documents. And he resigned from the commission. He said, this is not good. It's not quality research. Who is that? It is Max Cleland. He's a Vietnam War veteran. He lost both legs and one arm in the Vietnam War. And he was later a senator for Georgia, and he was in that commission. And he said, I cannot look any American in the eye, especially family members of the victims, and say that the 9/11 Commission had full access. The 9/11 Commission is now compromised. So he stepped down. He said, we didn't get the documents. We didn't get Cheney and Bush to testify under oath in public. We didn't get that. Cleveland said the Bush administration stonewalled the commission in its request for documents and other evidence about 9/11. That is really bad. That's bad news, because we as historians need a good investigation. What we then had in 2004 is that the authors of that commission presented their report and confirmed the surprise theory. Okay? That's the official theory, and is now being confirmed by the 9/11 Commission. And Bush thanked them very much. And really the question is whether you trust Thomas Keane and Lee Hamilton. It's again a question of whether you trust them. That's really the question. If as a historian you have to make up your mind, you have to always find out whom do you trust. Furthermore, they didn't write the report themselves. It was a professor. His name is Philip Zelikow. He wrote the book. It's a book of 560 pages, so it's a really thick book, and I read it with my students. They had to read it. And most people never read the 9/11 Commission report. But Philip Zelikow wrote the whole book, and he says surprise is the correct description of what happened on 9/11. Okay. But that's not the only story that you have in the United States. You have other people who completely disagree and say the 9/11 Commission report is worth nothing. Now, who are these people? He's a professor, David Ray Griffin. He's a retired professor, so he's no longer at university. You know, that's sometimes helpful, because obviously there's a lot of pressure. If you research 9/11 at university, you can lose your job, it's true. So retired US professor David Ray Griffin is a professor of philosophy of religion, okay? You know, that's not the first thing you think of if you think of somebody who'd researched 9/11. And he says 9/11 was not surprise, it was MIHOP, make it happen on purpose. So he argues that the American government orchestrated the attacks. He's not saying the American people. That's a huge difference. There's 300 million people living in America, and he's saying there's a corrupt elite, and they were involved in the attacks. He was dismissed in the beginning as somebody who's just crazy. But then he wrote 10 books. He started to write books about 9/11 in 2004. Then he added another one in 2005. Then in 2007. Then in 2008. Then in 9. In 9 he even wrote 2. And then in 2010 another one. And now the newest one is coming out in September 2011. It's quite impressive. So there's a whole series of books. And he's an outstanding scholar on 9/11. So if today you try to research 9/11, you have to read the 9/11 Commission report, obviously. That's the version of Bush. But also you have to read the books of David Ray Griffin. Not all, but maybe a selection. And he says, He believes that the US government orchestrated the attacks. The goal would be to get control of the world's oil and establish a new doctrine of preemptive warfare. That was a difficult sell before 9/11. So he really says, before 9/11, it would not have been possible to start preemptive wars. A preemptive war is a war that you engage in without having been attacked. You say, I bombed the other one because I think he's going to bomb me. Do you understand the difference? That's a huge difference. If you fight a war after having been attacked, then it's a defensive war. If you attack a country whom you have not, who has not attacked you, then it's either a war of aggression, and that's something very terrible since Hitler invaded Poland, in 1939. Historians are very, sensitive about wars of aggression. But now these wars are not called wars of aggression, the Iraq War, they are called preemptive wars. Because that means you do a war to stop a war which would be coming if you don't do your war. Griffin says there is no change. There is no change from Bush to Obama. There's no change. He says the White House has never, and to this very day, has never started a new investigation of the terrorist attacks of 9/11. There's no interest in the White House at all to have a new debate about 9/11. In the US Congress, so the Senate and the House of Representatives, there's no interest in such a debate either. But you do have former senators, former American senators, who say we must research 9/11 anew. One senator is Mike Gravel. He was a senator for Alaska from 69 to 81. And he's now saying we should have a movement in the states. So there's, the US is made up of different states, and one state, for instance, California, can decide we're going to have a new 9/11 investigation. And that would affect the whole discourse. He said, don't wait for White House, don't wait for Congress, go to the level of the states, and there we should have a new debate. He's saying the government's official account is inaccurate, incomplete, implausible, and in fact constitutes a flimsy conspiracy theory. So he's making the argument that the surprise theory is not convincing. He says there is an urgent need for a new independent investigation with subpoena powers and other grand jury powers. Subpoena basically means that you can say, we are investigating this, and everybody who was involved, who had an official function, has to come and testify under oath. That is really an important thing if you can do such an investigation. Now, what I've shown you in this chapter, I've had the 9/11 debate, is that there is a very big debate in the United States going on. There's no agreement on what happened. And I've seen that many people who ask questions about 9/11 are dismissed as people who believe in conspiracies. And that is then, put in a way that people suggest conspiracies are nonsense. That's what you see. And as historians, I'm obviously aware that sometimes you have conspiracies. For instance, when Fidel Castro and Nikita Khrushchev decided to put nuclear missiles into Cuba, they didn't tell Kennedy before, okay? That's the conspiracy, to agree silently. If two people agree in silence, that's a conspiracy. Or when the CIA overthrows Salvador Allende on September 11, but 1973, it was a conspiracy. They didn't call Salvador Allende first. Later you had Pinochet installed in Chile. So yes, there are conspiracies. Not everything is a conspiracy, but sometimes you have conspiracies. When the French Secret Service sank the Rainbow Warrior in 1985, they bombed the ship because Greenpeace was protesting against French atomic tests in the Pacific. So Greenpeace was also always going there with the ship, so the French couldn't have their atomic testing. They just sank the ship with a bomb. That's terrorism. But it's state terrorism. It's the Secret Service who carries it out, and this is the photographer who died on the boat. He wasn't informed of it, okay? So it's a conspiracy. Or the Iran-Contra affair in 1986. You had Oliver North, who was involved, and others, who sent money to the Contras, which they had earned from selling arms to Iran. And at the time, Congress had said the United States cannot sell arms to Iran. And then the White House ran away and secretly did it and used the money to fund the Contras in Nicaragua. That was a conspiracy. Or if you take the Watergate breaking, it's a very interesting conspiracy. Nixon, here to the left, and Haldeman, his chief of staff, Nixon, ordered this break-in in the Watergate complex, and then later, a week after the break-in, Haldeman told Nixon in the White House, "We now have the records." It always takes a long time until the historians have the records, but we have them. The democratic break-in thing, we're back to in the problem area because the FBI is not under control, Haldeman says, and then Nixon instructs to use the CIA to obstruct the FBI. So the White House sometimes uses the different services to obstruct each other, and they say, Nixon said, play it tough. That's the way they play it, and that's the way we're going to play. So that was a conspiracy. Nixon later had to resign. And if you take Bernard Madoff in 2008, it's a recent conspiracy, he told people, you give me your money, and I'm going to give you a lot of money. Okay, that was the idea. And he always said, I'm a great investor. But what he really did, he just, faked everything. It was a Ponzi scheme. He took the money from the new investors and paid interest to the others, but he had no real investment. And the lady who did all, the fake reports was Annette Bongiorno. Somebody says that's a hell of a secretary because she, copied everything and mixed it. But there you go. I mean, it was a conspiracy between Madoff and Bongiorno. And it doesn't make sense to say there are no conspiracies. The question is, on 9/11, how many people were involved? If it's just one person, you can't have a conspiracy. But if you assume that it was just one person who, with the first plane, flew into the Twin Tower, and then walked down, and then took a second plane and flew into the second tower, it's not possible. One person cannot do it. So you have at least two persons involved. And that means, from a scientific perspective, that it is a conspiracy. The question is, who are the conspirators? It can be the group of Muslims, then it's the surprise theory, or it can be somebody else. And that's really what you have to look at. In the detailed investigation of 9/11, the debate has always focused on the Twin Towers. These are the Twin Towers. Everybody has seen a plane fly in the building, then this exploded, and the second fly in that building, and then these buildings went down. So for most people, 9/11 is plane, building. That's the essence. But there's a third building which collapsed on that day. When people saw the Twin Towers, they were in shock. Okay? That's the important thing. Terror means fear. As you can see, they actually watched the Twin Towers being hit. There's a huge fear effect. But if you look at the whole World Trade Center complex, you see there's the Twin Tower these are the Twin Towers, WTC-1, WTC. They were hit by a plane, and they went down. But here's the third tower, and it was not hit by a plane. But it went down on 9/11 in 7 seconds. So obviously, people then ask, what does the 9/11 Commission report say about WT7? Because that's a crucial question. How do they explain the collapse of a building which has not been hit by a plane? They don't even mention the building. Okay? And that's really a very serious problem. I mean, if the 9/11 Commission report doesn't get the number of buildings right, yeah, you're laughing, but it's serious, It's very serious. The activation of NATO is based on the 9/11 Commission report. The surprise theory is based on the 9/11 Commission report. But the 9/11 Commission report doesn't get the number of buildings right. So WT7 before 9/11 and after 9/11. Flat. If you look at the different buildings, you see these are the Twin Towers. They're much higher, and that's WT7. It's smaller. It's not that high. And the New York Times at the time said, that's really a mystery. WT7 is a mystery. They said, until now, the collapse of 7 World Trade Center has stood as one of the outstanding mysteries of the September 11 attack. And since before then, no modern steel-reinforced high-rise in the United States had ever collapsed in a fire. And that's true for the entire world. They don't go down in a fire. But the Bush administration claimed that this fire brought the building down. Now, WT7, to my personal understanding, is the most important question in the whole 9/11 debate. And it's being discussed across the globe. I'm not sure whether you surf the internet a lot, but maybe if you do, you've maybe been on this webpage recently. That's a Japanese parliamentarian. His name is Yukihisa Fujita. And he presented in the Japanese parliament the collapse of WT7. That was in 2008. Showed everybody in the Japanese parliament. that WT7 collapsed. And people were surprised because most parliamentarians in Japan didn't know it. But here we're back to the fact that 9/11 happens in a period where we have the internet, where everybody has YouTube, where everybody has laptops, where everybody has cameras and is filming. You know, this is a completely different framework. You have to be aware of this information revolution which is taking place. And as we are here in Switzerland, I want to bring you a building which is very high so you can compare it to the World Trade Center. Here in Switzerland, we don't have high buildings. We all know that. But the highest building is now in Zurich. They just finished it. It's called the Prime Tower. It's 135 meters high. Now realize that the World Trade Center 7 is 170 meters high. So it's higher than the Prime Tower. And for us in Switzerland, that's quite a thing. Okay? So that's why we can never say WT7 is just a minor issue. It would be the biggest building in Switzerland. So what I did is, when I was working at the Center for Security Studies at the ETH in Zurich, I went to other professors and asked them, how does that building come down? And then one colleague said, I think there's a high probability that WT7 has been brought down by controlled demolition. So we sit at the ETH. And I say, no, there's no controlled demolition on 9/11, because that would take weeks to prepare it. And nobody said bin Laden blew up a building through controlled demolition. And then the other professor said, well, I don't know, maybe there's a plane that hit WT7 and you haven't heard about it. And I said, no, I know that. There's not. Yeah, you're laughing, but you know, this is the sort of level of debate that is going on behind the scenes. And then nobody really knows what happened. What we now have is a new web page in Switzerland. It's just been online for a few weeks. It's called 9/11 untersuchen, investigate 9/11. And a few people come forward. I've also signed it. And it basically is a petition to say we need more data. We need more data. Too many things are unclear. In 2002, we had a report by the Federal Emergency Management Agency, FEMA. It was called World Trade Center Building Performance Studies. And the FEMA said, the specifics of the fires in WT7 and how they caused the building to collapse remain unknown. Okay? So they said, yes, there was a fire, but we don't know how the fire could bring the building down. In the same report, you have a list of the tenants who were in the World Trade Center number 7, because people were interested. Who was in that building? And that list shows you that you had on floor 25 the Department of Defense and the Central Intelligence Agency. So this was a high security building. It was part of the defense community. And those who distrust the Bush administration and those who think it was MIHOP, 9/11 was MIHOP, you know, they come to me and say, it's very clear, it was all done from WT7, that was the control room for 9/11, and they just blew it up. And I say, do you really believe that? And I say, yes. And I say, okay, I take a note, now look at it. And then I go home and I look at the data and I say, I don't know who was in that building on that day and what they did, but I know that the building collapsed. So what I'm saying is that we need more investigation on why it collapsed. The National Institute for Standards and Technology said in a report published in 2008 that WT7 collapsed because of fires. It did not collapse from explosives. He explicitly said it did not collapse because of explosives. Why did he say that? Because at the time, and still today, many people say that was brought down by controlled demolition. And that is now the argument, either fire or either controlled demolition. And that is very, very difficult to argue what the truth is. Because we really need the iron beams, but we don't have them. The iron frame of the building, that would help. But, you know, it has been recycled. There's no access to this primary data. Now, Richard Gage comes forward and says, the NIST report, okay, that's the NIST report, published in 2008. Now, Richard Gage is a professor, he's an architect, and he's founded the movement Architects for 9/11 Truth and Engineers. So there's 1,500 architects in the US who say, we don't believe the story. And you have to understand, people sometimes come to me and say, well, we heard the Bush version and then we heard nothing. If somebody has doubts, he would have raised his voice. We don't hear from Richard Gage in the Swiss newspaper. But if you don't hear it, then it's a question of how good is your, information structure, your newspaper, your television, whatever. And it's not the point that nobody is saying anything. It's just it doesn't reach you. So the interesting question is really, we should ask the man who owned the World Trade Center. We should ask him what happened on that day. And the man is Larry Silverstein. He leased the World Trade Center on July 24, 2001, just shortly before the attacks. Then he signed insurance policies with 24 insurance companies for a total of 3.5 billion. And then he received 4.5 billion after WT 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, that's the whole thing, was destroyed. So he's really the man to ask. He's in the middle of all this. And he said this on television, I remember getting a call from the fire department commander telling me that they were not sure they were going to be able to contain the fire. And I said, we've had such terrible loss of life, maybe the smartest thing to do is to pull it. And they made that decision to pull, and we watched the building collapse. So really here the argument is, what did he mean with to pull it? Did he mean to bring it down with controlled demolition, or did he mean something else? So later he said, no, I didn't mean controlled demolition. I meant to pull the firemen out of the building. But then semantics, professors for linguistics came and said, it never refers to people. So you have a huge debate. Yeah, you're not smiling, but it's really complicated. If you go into the detail, you realize 9/11 investigation is complicated. We have now firemen who say there were explosives.
What happened?
There was an explosion. We was in the lobby, and the third explosion, the whole lobby collapsed on us.
What was it like? What was it like?
Horrible. The whole building just collapsed on us inside the lobby.
Was that a secondary explosion?
Yes, it was.
That was the planet, probably.
Yeah, definitely a secondary explosion. Because we was inside waiting to go upstairs, and on the way upstairs, the whole fucking plane blew, and it just collapsed on everybody inside the lobby.
Similar to the first tower coming down, secondary.
I don't know about the first one, but I know the second one was terrible. Then there was a third one too after that one.
Third explosion after that.
That's right. Everybody was inside the building, waiting to go upstairs, and they just let loose. Everything just let loose inside the building.
So what you tell me is that there was a plane or whatever hit the building, then a secondary explosion.
It was like 3 explosions after that. We came in after the fire. We came when the fire was going on already. We was in the staging area inside the building, waiting to go upstairs. Then it exploded. Then the whole lobby collapsed on the lobby inside.
And is this mayhem after that?
Everybody tried to make their way out. A lot of people was trapped inside and everything.
In the Brooklyn Navy Yard across from Brooklyn. We watched the first explosion. As we're watching the buildings, I saw a black, very large airplane fly right into the second building. Came out of the south, right in front of our eyes. Just, it was so surreal, like a movie set. We were in the building for the third one collapse, and I was on this drive here for the other one.
People don't understand. There may be more. Any one of these fucking buildings can blow up. This ain't done yet.
This is on the top of this. This couldn't be no worse than this. Couldn't be nothing no more worse than this. You're in the building trying to help people, and it's exploding on you inside the building. So
these people come forward and say, yes, there were explosives. Bang, bang. We don't know what to do with it. We have professors in the US who come forward. This is Stephen Jones, who says it's quite plausible that explosives were pre-planted in the 3 buildings. Now that's not the official story. Then we have professors in Denmark. This man is called Niels Harris, and he says, we researched the dust, okay? We researched the dust that we found on World Trade Center, and he says, in the dust, what we have found is a modern version of termite, which we call nanotermite. So this is if you look at criminal movies, right? It's always the case, there's a dead body, and then the special team comes and they dust off every detail, right? To find DNA or find details, and they take it in the lab and they go into these micro structures, which is not my world. But the same thing happened here, and there are people who say, well, we found explosives. And I thought, if they're saying this, we're going to have a huge new debate. But that never happened. Most people never discuss this research. I want to know, where did they get the samples from? Is it really explosives or is it something else? It is important to know. No debate. Another really bizarre thing is that on 9/11 you had this journalist called Jane Stanley. She said a 3rd building has collapsed. Okay, she said this. And now remember, on the internet, everybody's on the internet, people analyze videos all the time. And they said, while she said it, the building was still standing. So that's really bad. How can she say WT7 collapses while it's still standing? How does she know? Who was she working for? BBC World News. And here, the line is the 47-story Salomon Brothers building, that's WT7. Close to the World Trade Center has also collapsed. Okay? That's the line, they put it in. And then people who say, this is incredible, the media is not telling us the truth on 9/11. They said, Jane Stanley is somebody who lies to us. So they attacked that journalist personally. And then BBC World News in 2008 offered a story and said, we're very sorry, we were working on an incorrect news agency report. We had this statement from Reuters. Okay? They hand it on and say, we have it from Reuters. But Reuters is a huge media information system. On September 11, 2001, Reuters incorrectly reported that one of the buildings of the New York Trade Center, WT7, had collapsed before it actually did. That's what Reuters said by email. How they came to this conclusion, no explanation. But understand, a historian has to write history. How do we write history in this context? It's really complicated. The journalist itself, this person, Jane Stanley, she had a very hard time, okay? She quit her job and took a time out because she had some sort of a burnout, because everybody was attacking her as being a liar. And, you know, she, in retrospect, says it was a mistake. She knows that the building was still standing, but obviously, she's not the one to blame. She said, I was thrown, not a question, but a statement of fact. I don't know where that came from. So you have to imagine the journalists on that day were standing in New York, a lot of things were happening, it was a terrible day, and they just read it into the camera, okay? So she didn't do the research for this, so she really can't be blamed. But what you now have is that mothers and brothers of people who died in the attacks also go and question WT7. I lost my son on 9/11. Most people don't know that a third tower fell on September 11. They put up movies on the internet and say, we want that people remember Building 7. They put on websites to have a debate on this. Okay, we come to chapter 5. Chapter 5 basically says the Pentagon is the other side where we have to look at. Now, the important thing for you to notice is that the Pentagon is flat. It has 5 corners, that's why it's Pentagon, but it's flat. It's not like the Twin Towers high, it's flat. So the official story is that it was hit by a plane, like that. This is not a picture, this is a computer simulation to show how low the plane has to fly to hit the Pentagon. And then we have pictures of the Pentagon after it had been hit. And then people went and said, we can't see no plane here. If it hits the Pentagon, it should be here. George Nelson, who worked for the US Air Force and is, his job was aircraft accident investigator and airplane parts authority. He was 34 years in the Air Force. He says, with all the evidence readily available at the Pentagon crash site, any unbiased, rational investigator could only conclude that the Boeing 757 did not fly into the Pentagon as alleged. Now that's complicated. Is he right or is he wrong? You know, as a historian, I have Bush who tells us that the Pentagon was hit by a plane. Then I have these people stepping out and saying, no, it was not hit by a plane. So that's really complicated. We have to write history, remember. So we look at the pictures again, and that's when the fire is extinguished. And the picture that was later shown is when part of the building collapsed, but that's half an hour later. You have to look at the data right after the Pentagon was hit, and not this picture. This is half an hour later. And you had a French journalist who, soon after the attacks, his name is Thierry Mason, said, in 2003, the Pentagon was not hit by an airplane. And that was a huge debate, you know. The 9/11, the big lie, and everybody said he's crazy. And he said, no, it was a missile. You know, the Pentagon fired a missile into the Pentagon and then said we were attacked by Osama bin Laden. That's what he basically suggested. He couldn't prove it, but he said that could be. And he said, we certainly see a hole in the Pentagon at the back of the wall. This is the entrance side, and something penetrated these different rings, and it came out here. So it has to be something very solid. And as historians, we would like to go back to the Pentagon and look at that hole. But obviously you can't do that, because it has all been reconstructed. That is in March 2002. What we did get, however, is a video. Many people said, we want a video to see how the plane hits the Pentagon. So after many years, the Pentagon produced the video, and this is the video. It came out in 2006. You see something hits the Pentagon. Something. But it's not clear what. We come to Dick Cheney. He's the vice president on September 11, and he is in the White House when the Pentagon is allegedly hit by a plane. And now we have the former Minister for Transport, Norman Mineta, who was in the White House on that same day. And he says, in that moment, before the Pentagon was hit, Cheney had a strange communication with somebody I don't know. Okay? And Norman Mineta went before the 9/11 Commission and said this was the communication. He said, in the White House on that morning, there was a young man who had come in and said to the vice president, the plane is 50 miles out, the plane is 30 miles out, and when it got down to the plane is 10 miles out, the young man also said to the vice president, do the orders still stand? And the vice president turned and whipped his neck around and said, of course, the orders still stand. Have you heard anything to the contrary? Now, we do not know who that young man was, and we do not know what the orders were. And the problem is, this statement was not included in the 9/11 Commission report, although it is an important statement to find out what Dick Cheney was doing on 9/11. Let me come to chapter 6, the put options. Many people don't know that on 9/11, a lot of money was made. Okay? It's also about money. On the one hand, through the insurance that had to pay for the destruction of the World Trade Center. On the other hand, you had people who speculated that the shares of United Airlines and American Airlines would go down, and you can speculate on shares that can go down with put options. Those of you who don't know much about international finance don't know put options, but put option basically is a bet that a share will fall. It's nothing criminal, okay? It's happening every day. But on that specific day, you have bets on United Airlines and American Airlines. What we research is a colleague of mine, he's Professor Mark Chesney at the Institute of Banking at Zurich University. He researched whether you also have a lot of call options on that day. Call and put, call means that you speculate that the shares will go up, and put is that they go down. And you need to find out whether there's significant more put. And there's significantly more put, that's clear. And then you looked, maybe somebody was speculating that the whole airline industry will have problems. And they also speculated on Lufthansa and Singapore Airlines and whatever. But no, they only speculated on United and American. And those were the two airlines involved. So really, this is insider trading, clearly. What does the 9/11 Commission report say? It says, some unusual trading did in fact occur. The volume of put options surged in the parent companies of United Airlines on September 6 and American Airlines on September 10. Yet further investigation revealed that the trading had no connection with 9/11. A single US-based institutional investor with no conceivable ties to Al-Qaeda purchased 95% of the United Airlines puts. So they didn't investigate it any further. And that is incredible. You obviously have to investigate this further. But in the report, it is buried on page 49 in footnote 130. Who's going to find it? I find it. But most people don't even read the report. We have one congresswoman, he's Cynthia McKinney. She said in 2002 that this is not right. She said those people who dealt with unusual put options shortly before 9/11 knew enough to make millions. And it's not right to make money out of terrorist attacks. It's not right. So clearly, we need to know more. Let me come to chapter 7, Able Danger. Able Danger is an operation that was not known in the years after 9/11. It was a plan to look at Muslim terrorists who are in the United States, to observe them and watch their every move. The 9/11 Commission report fails to mention that a year before the attacks, a secret Pentagon project called Able Danger had identified 4 9/11 hijackers, including leader Mohammed Atta. That was revealed in 2005 by the New York Times. Most people at that time didn't, read about 9/11. They just, went on with their daily business. But it is very important if the leading hijackers had been watched by the Pentagon, okay? Mohammed Atta flew in the North Tower, and Marwan al-Shehri allegedly flew in the South Tower, and they had all been on the watch list. So people who believe in the Lee Hop theory, in the let it happen on theory, let it happen on purpose theory, they say able danger proves that those terrorists operated under the umbrella of the Pentagon. Whether that is true or not, I don't know. But you have a congressman, Kurt Weldon, who said, unbelievable, it's a cover-up of information on the largest attack in the history of the country. The 9/11 Commission did not do its job. It's time to get the facts to the American people. He said, we need new investigation into able danger. And he said, I can't understand that it's not in the 9/11 Commission report. Thomas Keane and Lee Hamilton, who had written the report, said that able danger did not turn out to be historically significant. I'm very surprised that they say that. They just say, this is not significant. They put it aside. Now, I'm a historian with a PhD, and I tell you, yes, it's historically significant. Of course it should be in the report. Of course you should have more investigation on that. Who is the source? How do we know that able danger took place? The source is Colonel Anthony Schaefer. He's 42 years old in 2005. He's from Kansas, and he had blown the story in August 2005. He said he had to risk his career by discussing able danger. Many people come forward and say, you know, if there were people who found out shady things about 9/11, if it's a conspiracy, then these people would step forward and I would hear about it. Then I say, well, yes, there are people who step forward, but you don't hear about it. That's the main question. Colonel Schaefer was part of a secret Pentagon operation. He said that his role in able danger was a liaison with the Defense Intelligence Agency, DIA. That's one of, there are many different secret services in the US, not only the CIA and the FBI, there's also the DIA and the NSA and a lot more. He was not involved in the details of the strategy used in able danger, but he said, I do believe the 9/11 Commission should have done that job, figuring out what went wrong with able danger. Because if they watched the terrorists, why didn't they stop them? I'm proud of my operational record, he says, and I love what I do. But there comes a time, and I believe the time for me is now, to stand for something, to stand for what is right. So he stepped up and said, we need more information on what happened on 9/11. Nothing happened. Nothing happened. Now, obviously, we have to talk about Osama bin Laden, okay? Because Osama bin Laden is the biggest suspect of the terrorist attack. He's the official terrorist. And we have to talk quickly about him. And we know that he is a militant Muslim. That is a fact. He was fighting the Russians in Afghanistan in the 1980s. Why? Because he was convinced that the Russians are atheists. Of course they were. They were communists. And he said, there's no atheists that should be in Afghanistan. Afghanistan is a Muslim country. Let's get them out of the country. That was his idea. At the time, the CIA funded him and cooperated with him. You have to understand that 9/11 reaches beyond the technical debate of WT7. It reaches into the debate how Christians and Muslims and other religions can coexist peacefully. That's a very interreligious debate, which is important. And you see that here you have Saudi Arabia, you have Mecca. And that's the holy place for the Muslims. And some don't understand Osama bin Laden when he says, the American soldiers who came to Saudi Arabia insulted Islam. That is his conviction. And if we as Christians think about it, it would be very much as if the Muslim would occupy the Vatican. Now, you know, I'm not sure how strongly you feel about the Vatican, but it's just to give you an idea that a Catholic would not like to see Muslim troops in the Vatican. And the same way, the Muslims don't like to see Christian soldiers in Saudi Arabia. Do you get what I'm saying? But after the Gulf War with George Bush Sr., you obviously had American troops there, and there's a lot of oil there. So they stayed. Globally, we need, this is a supertanker, we need 44 supertankers of oil every day. Okay? So the oil dependency of the world today is very high. And bin Laden didn't like the idea that the Americans had soldiers in Saudi Arabia. So he said in '96, US soldiers must leave Saudi Arabia as the country had been turned into an American colony. I gave advice to the Americans to withdraw their troops from Saudi Arabia. Bin Laden insisted. So I'm saying, yes, It is possible that bin Laden was involved in the terrorist attacks. I'm saying we need more research on that. But we do see that the Americans, after 9/11, did not distance themselves from the Saudi government, but continued to have very close relationship due to the oil. This is a picture taken in 2005, and you see the King of Saudi Arabia hand in hand with the American president in Texas. Students always ask, but why do they do that? I mean, according to the official story, most of the terrorists came from Saudi Arabia. Why didn't they bomb Saudi Arabia? That, that's the sort of debate that you have in seminars. I say, you have to look at the oil. Where is the oil? And if you look at the oil, this is the world oil reserves. It's here. That's the reserves. And that's Saudi Arabia, Iraq, and Iran. That's the biggest fields where the oil is. And if you look at world religions, then you see in this color is Christian. So North and South America is Christian. Europe is Christian, except for Bosnia and Albania. Southern part of Africa is Christian. Australia is Christian. China is atheist. India is Hinduism. Russia, some sort of a transition period, if you want. And this green area is the Muslim world. Okay. Now, you don't need to be a brilliant analyst to see that the big oil is in the Muslim countries. You don't need to be brilliant to find this. And behind the scenes, obviously, you have very, very close contacts between these governments in the oil regions and the Americans and the Chinese, because the Chinese and the Americans want the oil. They really need it. Here you have Rumsfeld in 2003 debating with the Saudis what should be done next, whether they can increase the production when the US will bomb Iraq, because otherwise, they will have not enough oil production in Iraq and the oil price will go through the roof, and that would be very expensive. Now we have news that Osama bin Laden is dead. How do we hear this? On video screens. Okay? May 2011, you have a video screen. Bin Laden is dead. And who is the source to confirm whether that is true or not? It's the president. Now the question is the same old question. Do you trust the president or don't you trust the president? And that really divides people. Some people trust the president and some people don't. What's the evidence? The president published pictures where they say, we are looking at a picture of how Osama bin Laden is killed, but we don't see the picture of how bin Laden is killed. What we do get as historians is a picture of the house where he allegedly was. That's in Pakistan. And we get pictures of blood on the floor, and the footage this is exclusive news. Just think about the quality of information that you get that is sold as exclusive news. It's very poor, because we don't see bin Laden. It could be anybody who lost blood there. Then the story goes that bin Laden was brought to the USS Carl Vinson, which is an aircraft carrier, and that then, he was already dead, they sank him in the Indian Ocean. So if anybody wants to try and test whether bin Laden is dead or not, he has to search in this area. And that's impossible. You can't do it. We as historians can't search there. It's impossible. We don't know. We can trust or not trust the president. But who told the president that bin Laden was there, dead? Leon Panetta. He's the CIA director. So the question really again is, do you trust Leon Panetta? It burns down to that question. And it's not funny. It's true. That's the question. You can also, there's another person who was involved in the killing of Osama bin Laden, and his name is William McRaven. He's an admiral, so he's a high-ranking officer, and he runs the Joint Special Operations Command. That's the Special Forces. So in the end, you have to trust the Special Forces and the Secret Service. And that makes it very difficult, because the Special Forces and the Secret Service are considered as the ones who are involved in the crime by those who think it was Lee Hop and Me Hop. Do you understand? It really divides into different groups. So bin Laden probably is dead. Do we have anybody else? Anybody else who can confirm what happened on 9/11? Yes, we have somebody. His name is Khalid Sheikh Mohammed. He was captured in 2003 in Pakistan. He's usually called KSM because Khalid Sheikh Mohammed is a bit long. And then he was brought to Guantanamo. And he claims that he was tortured in Guantanamo. And in 2007, Khalid Sheikh Mohammed says that he was responsible for 9/11. okay? And that bin Laden was involved in 9/11. So he's now the prime witness for the surprise story. The problem is, if he's been tortured, people say, you know, you'd say anything under torture. It's not a valid testimony. So the US Attorney General, so it's the Justice Minister in the US, Eric Holder, announced in November 2009 that he wants KSM to take him from Guantanamo and bring him to New York and have a fair trial. You know, public, with a hearing, everything. But then, in April 2011, so that's new, he declared that KSM will not be brought to New York, but face a military trial at the Guantanamo Bay detention facility. So really, you have, in the end, probably a military trial. If he's found guilty, he will face the death penalty, and then that will be the end of the story. When I discuss with students 9/11, some say, well, it is really difficult to imagine surprise, LEHOP, and MEHOP, because MEHOP would mean that the government plans to attack its own population, okay? And that just psychologically is just incredible, they say. Because, you know, we pay taxes to the government, and the government is supposed to protect us. I mean, paying taxes is already hard. But if then the government attacks its own population, is there any evidence that we have documents that this ever happened? I'm saying yes. There's one case where we have documents that the government planned to attack the population. They planned, they didn't do it. The context is back in the Cuban Missile Crisis. Remember, Eisenhower and Nixon didn't like Fidel Castro. They wanted to get rid of him. So we had the Bay of Pigs invasion in April 1961. It failed, okay? Castro is still alive, you know, still there. But at the time, the president was very angry, and he said the CIA messed it up. The Pentagon should have a new plan of how to have a war against Cuba, because, you know, we need a start to start the war. And there is now an original document from 1962, and justification for US military intervention in Cuba. It was top secret for many, many years, and now it is declassified. It's a Pentagon document. And I'm just bringing this here to show you that as historians we're very slow. Sorry for that. Usually takes 40 years until we get these documents. It's a bit late, very sorry. And what the generals suggest is we should have a remember the Maine incident. We could blow up a US ship in Guantanamo Bay and blame Cuba. So that is false flag terrorism. Blow up a ship and say the other one did it. We could develop a communist Cuban terror campaign in the Miami area, in Florida cities, and even in Washington. Remember, that's the Cold War. That's why it reads communist. Today it would read Islamist. It really is the idea to produce a terror campaign in your own country. And the third thing, what they suggest, is exploding a few plastic bombs in carefully chosen spots, the arrest of Cuban agents, and the release of prepared documents substantiating Cuban involvement would be helpful in projecting the idea of an irresponsible government, meaning irresponsible Cuban government. Because then the American people would be so angry that right away you'd have an invasion, a normal invasion. That would not be the toppling of the Castro, that would be the reason to have a war. Now this was stopped, okay? But these are original documents, and now my students want to know, how do the people look? How do they look who write something like that? They got to be really, really, really evil. How do they look? I say it's not very spectacular. That's the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. That's the highest military ranking officers. And what do they want? They want victory, okay? That's what they want. That somebody gets killed is normal in military business. They want victory. And, you know, camouflage and deceit is part of it. Limnit Lemnitzer here, to the left, is the one who signed the document. And why was it not carried out? Because Kennedy stopped it. Kennedy said, I don't want that this operation is being carried out. And he said, Lemnitzer has to leave. He was the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. That's the highest ranking military officer in the Pentagon. So he had to leave. He was transferred to Europe. He became the Supreme Allied Commander of NATO. So sent them over. I conclude. We went through all these 10 points. I said, we have to investigate 9/11 again. We have to look at surprise, LEHOP, MEHOP. We have to look at the 9/11 debate. the term conspiracies is used wrongly to discredit anybody who questions the official version. But as historians, we're trained to question presidents and prime ministers, okay? Always, because we say if there's a lot of power, there's a lot of abuse of power, okay? That's our training. So I feel very strange about this conspiracy theory debate. It's not about conspiracies, it's about, do we find out what happened on 9/11? WT7 is a very important issue. Either it was brought down by fire, or it was brought down by controlled demolition. That's the two possibilities. More research is needed. The Pentagon is a very important question. Either it was hit by a plane, or it was hit by a missile. That's a very important question. The put options are an important question. Either they can be traced back to Al-Qaeda, it doesn't seem to be the case, or it was insiders in the United States who, carried out the trade. Bin Laden is dead, probably. We're not able to check that because he's in the Indian Ocean, really. Northwoods is just a document, a historical document, which shows that sometimes crazy things are being planned, okay? And the conclusion really is that we should take a little distance. We should take a step back. That's my last slide. And we should reflect on the 10 years, because we've all lived through the 10 years. Nobody's younger than 10 years here, right? So, recently I had a class, and I said, well, everybody remembers where they were on September 11th. And one of the students raised her hand. She said, I don't remember. I said, she's got to be kidding. Why is she saying that? I said, why don't you remember where you were on September 11th? She said, I was 11 years old. And then I started to realize that my students are now 21, and some of them, they don't know what happened then. They want to read the history books, but we have to write the history books. And I just explained to you how difficult it is to write these books. So when I take a step back, I'm just saying my firm conviction is that we must stop killing each other based on a story that we have not even understood. Okay? That's the whole thing. Thanks for your attention. Good luck.